Today's actually kind of the last day where I do a limited lecture and you do some in-class stuff where you leave because you've already finished it. Starting on Thursday, you get to hear me lecture more because we're getting into some stuff with PHP and then with JavaScript, where the book does, I think, a good job of starting the conversation, but not necessarily filling in all the details. Just like actually with the CSS stuff, it's done a good job, I think, of giving you the nitty-gritty without giving you a good overall picture of CSS. So I think that the book realizes that if it starts going a lot into the general view of the forest, that very quickly it's going to get page bloat. So it goes right in and focuses on the trees, but you don't get a good overview of the thing. So actually today, I'm going to be giving you my overview of CSS, and then I'm going to let you, the book basically focus on the nitty-gritty of things. And then we're going to also today start just very briefly into PHP. We're really going to start hitting it hard on Thursday. And then for a while, until toward really the last week of the class or so, I'm going to be lecturing again. Toward the last week of the class, you're going to again have in-class activities. So that's kind of where things are going. Okay, so CSS. On last Thursday, you were doing basic CSS. Today, more advanced CSS. And cascading style sheets, again, what you're doing is you're specifying the appearance of your web interface. But what the book's not really getting at very well is CSS is doing there's two things that you're really concerned with CSS. One is geometry, which is really page layout, okay? So it's positioning. When I say geometry, it's the positioning of the elements on a page. And then the second thing is appearance, like physical characteristics, I'll say appearance. So that is things like color, font family, font face like bold, underline, italics, font size, things like that. So these are the two main things that you're dealing with in CSS. Chapter 4 is mostly about appearance. Chapter 5 is geometry plus some other things like animations and this and that. CSS, in my opinion, does appearance really well. CSS has always struggled with geometry. One issue with websites in general versus a printed document is printed documents have pages, right? Discrete pages. That doesn't really happen with a website. A website has a discrete horizontal boundary, but doesn't typically have a so-called discrete vertical boundary. So that's the difference between a printed document and a website. A website tends to have an infinite vertical dimension. And CSS has always struggled with that vertical dimension. It's been fairly good at laying things out horizontally. It's been really bad at laying things out vertically. Like, let's say you want to center something in a web browser. It is virtually impossible to do that vertically. You can do it horizontally. It's virtually impossible to do it vertically. Okay? And the reason that you hear time and again, don't use tables to do layout with HTML. But the reason people kept using tables to do layout, even though again and again you hear the admonition, don't use tables to do layout, is if you use tables, you can do vertical alignments. So within table cells, you can align stuff vertically. And so the reason you saw or see a lot of older designs use tables is because it was the only way you could control vertical alignment in or the geometry on a web page. CSS has just really struggled with that. Recently, they have come up with something called flexboxes, which is in a pointer at the end of one of your sections on page layout, but it's not actually in the book. And flexboxes, I'm not going to hold you responsible for them, but flexboxes is probably the best answer I've seen for vertical layout yet from CSS. So I'm just going to tell you that historically, the weakness, historically, CSS is weak in vertical layout or alignment. And I will admit, I am not, of the 4 areas we'll talk about, CSS is easily my weakest, so someone can correct me if they have more experience than I do, but I don't believe there is still a way to really effectively tell something that you want to hold everything in a single visible page. I think CSS, you can still essentially control left to right alignment, but I still don't think you can stop things from slopping off the bottom of the page and forcing the user to scroll up. Okay? So basically, CSS is all left to right or right to left layout, and then if there's not enough horizontal space for it, it forces everything vertically down. Okay, and at least that's my understanding of how it is and how I know that's how it's been in the past. Okay, so that's the first thing, okay, that I want you to kind of be aware of, in which the book doesn't really talk about. 2 things with CSS. It controls geometry, it controls appearance. And it's historically been weak with doing vertical layout and alignment. Okay. Second thing I really want you to understand is that a critical difference between a website and a published document is that in a published document, you control what goes on a page. It has a notion of a page, a bounded vertical dimension. You don't really have that in a website. And the website is kind of one continuous long document, and you have a window that scrolls into part of that. But you don't have this notion of discrete pages. And in fact, when I design tests, I can put stuff into the CSS styling that forces page breaks for printing purposes, but you'd never see it on the screen. So when I designed the CS140 midterm, I probably shouldn't show it to you. It's not been released. Let's do the previous one. Okay, we'll do this one instead. This one is released. So I can put so you see this selector dot break. First of all, does anyone remember, this is one of the important things with CSS, what dot break, what that's matching up with? Class, the class attribute. So the class attribute is important for being able to do styling. And you see that I say page break before always. That's really a print command. So when I do this for later on, class equals break, okay, you'll see there's a break that's going to force a break. Let's take a look at that. Suppose I have the following declarations in code. Okay, it's an 11-point problem. No, we're not. Okay, what do you notice? Is there a break here? Suppose I have the following declarations in code. There's no break, right? There is no page break. It turns out, but let's say I print it. There we go. Look at that, page break. So you actually, when you design HTML, you can do cute things for publication and force stuff to happen on a printed page that will be ignored by a web browser. Okay? So with CSS, you can actually control how your website will print out nicely on a printed page. So often when you on a web browser, you hit that print button, oftentimes there is CSS in there that controls how it is formatted on a page. Has no effect on the website viewing, but it controls the page. Okay, so that was important. Next thing that is really important in the book, kind of buried, but I want you to be aware of. Right at the end, it says box model. This is really critical. This is one of the ways you control both positioning and appearance is with their box model. There's three important things that you have. You have padding, you have border, and you have margin. Okay, and these concepts are really important. And here, this blue area right here is padding. Okay, the black area, so the black area, that's border, and this white area is margin. So the padding is extra space between the content and the border so that the content doesn't butt up right against the border. The border, you can actually make it like here. It has 5 pixels of width, and then the margin forces some separation between two elements. Okay? So padding, border, margin are really important. And the box model, it's important you understand that because box model is how you control it's the first way at the lowest level that you control the geometry of an object. Okay? So that's kind of within or intra-object, I think of it. So that's kind of like the intra because it's within the object for positioning, intra-object geometry. Okay, then you get the so-called inter-object, which is what page layout is about, inter-object geometry. And there's kind of 3 ways to think about this. There's 3 different main things that are provided by CSS for geometry, or for, I'll call it positioning. Okay, so this is really geometry. The first is float. So you can cause, okay, so you put things into container objects. Things like divs, okay? Container objects that contain content. So you can kind of think of these as you have little rectangles of content, okay? And those are the things that are divs or paragraphs or like lists. So then what you're trying to do is take these containers and you're trying to position them on the screen. Okay, the first is float. You can float things left or right. So that gives you a flexible layout. So one thing that CSS abhors is fixed positioning. Okay, can anyone think why fixed positioning is bad? Why saying something should appear at location 650 pixels from the left side of the screen? Why is that bad? Because what? Screen size. Because normally this thing is going to render on different devices. Okay, 650 on any of your laptops should be okay. 650 on my cell phone probably doesn't work. Okay, so CSS abhors fixed positioning because things have to show up on different screen sizes. So floating things left and right is the first way that you are flexible with your layout. So maybe on a big screen, I can lay these 4 things out like this. And I might be saying float the first one left, this one might float left, this one might float right. You could also have it float left. Actually, you might say both of them float left. So this would float left first, this would float over here. You might also want this one to float left if possible, but if there's not enough screen space, it's then forced down to the next line. If there was enough screen space, this float left would actually appear up here. So when you float things, if there's not enough horizontal space, if the horizontal space is compressed, things are just moved down. So as I started to move my screen space in, this thing would actually float down like this. It would become more like a vertical column of things. So if I numbered this 1, 2, 3, and 4, it would now look like 1, 2, 3, and 4. So the nice thing about float left and right is it's not doing it. It lets the web browser determine how to lay it out based on this horizontal space that it has. Again, notice I'm saying horizontal space. Okay, so that's the first way you control things. Second way you control things is with the static, relative, fixed, and of course I meant to look this up beforehand and I forgot to do so. So let's clear this off, clear the ink, go to the next one, and look at positioning, and it is absolute, oh, I thought I had it, absolute, relative, static, and fixed. Well, here it is. So there's a position attribute that you can use, okay? Position right there. And there's 3 things that you can do. Static, which is the default. It basically says let the web browser do its thing. Relative, which says you want to move it around relative to your normal position. So here, start, okay? Its normal position is right there. If it were just laid out with nothing else, it would be right there. Once you add relative positioning and you add left minus 20, of course it messes it up. You add 20 and it pushes it in. So relative says I want to push it a little from its normal thing. I don't like this. I would use padding. If you want to do this, use padding. Okay? So I really don't like relative positioning because I think you can accomplish the same things using padding. But you need to know what these things do because you see them. Fixed means that you are fixing it in a fixed location in the viewport and it can't move. Right here. This iBook stuff, no matter what I do, it's fixed. Okay? So I'm pretty sure without looking at their source that they're using some kind of fixed positioning to force this title thing to stay at the top. Okay, so fixed is a way to, no matter how the viewport moves, it always stays in a fixed location. You typically only use fixed to nail something to the top of the screen or the left or right side of the screen. Sometimes I guess you might nail it to the bottom too, but again, because you have infinite space on the bottom, you normally only fix things at the top, left, or right. Okay, and then absolute positioning is a nightmare. Okay, it's just really hard to understand because it's positioning things next to, as they say, the nearest positioned ancestor. So something is considered to be, they might as well have said here, the nearest user positioned ancestor. So if the web browser was allowed to position it using static positioning, then it doesn't count. But if you have the closest ancestor that uses relative fixed or absolute positioning, then anytime you use left or right, you're positioning relative to it. It's really hard to understand. Okay, I just don't encourage you to use it, but you need to see it. Okay, I hate the position attribute, except the fixed when you need to nail something to a fixed location in the browser. So that I needed to add absolute here. Okay, uses the position property. Okay, typically I typically only use fixed. Okay, I think that padding usually works for relative. Not always, but for the most part. Okay, and absolute is just hard to understand. I mean, it doesn't mean you can't use it, but it's hard to not understand. It's hard to make it work right. At least in my experience. So I just don't like using position if I can avoid it. But you'll see it, and obviously it was the first section in Chapter 5. Third thing is page layout. So part of that, not all of it, but there's a display property. And that's still a bit of an intra-object thing, but within a container, so display property is more for within a container object. Okay, so I'll say laying out contents of a container. Okay, and then page layout is more about laying out the containers. Okay, laying out the containers. So the display property is good for laying out the contents of a container, like a list or a paragraph. And the two big ones for display are block and inline. Those are the two biggies. So blocks are things like paragraphs that when you lay out two things in block, they will appear beneath each other. It's like there's a page break. Okay, so it acts like a page break. Line break, sorry, not a page break. So it puts things below. Inline means it tries to put things side by side. So if you say something is inline, okay, it puts contents side by side. And it's only if it runs out of horizontal space that it pushes something to the next line. Okay, so these are the two most common. You see other ones. I'm just giving you a high-level overview here. Okay, so again, block and inline kind of controlling. Block says lay things out vertically. Inline effectively says lay them out horizontally. Okay, then you've laid out the container. You want to lay out all the containers. And we already talked about you can do it with the float left, float right. You can do it with the positioning things. And then the third thing that you can do is you can use the various page layout stuff. So going here to page layout. Okay, so this fluid layout basically is saying we don't want to use fixed positioning. We want to give the browser control over how things are put on the screen. And you see here typical web layout, but actually these are new CSS styling things that you can actually give to different components, and they tell, like you can tell the web browser that something is a header, something is a footer, something is a section, something is an article. And the web browser is supposed to then roughly put them into this, I guess, juxtaposition of things on the screen. So this was one way that you get a fluid layout, is basically giving your containers these different labels. Article, nav for navigation, header for header, and then the web page can lay it out. Okay, and it was asking you to do that, and you can actually see there it is. You're actually using HTML. So I'm sorry, they're not CSS tags. They're actually HTML tags that you use to describe what the container should be. And then the web browser will often have ways of treating it. Now, they then went ahead and did some of their own styling with it. But the web browsers often will be able to style these things on their own once you've told it what the type of the container is. Okay? So it has some stuff with fluid layout. But this is the one, whoops, yeah, Flexbox. So I'm just going to go to it quickly. So CSS, W3 Schools has really good stuff for describing things. And essentially what a Flexbox is, it's a box where you can put a bunch of containers. And you can control like the size of the container, so you can say it should be 100% of the width of the screen or 50% of the width. And then it will put as many boxes as it can. And if you don't, let's see, don't think I'm going to be, yep, there we go. So there, in this case, it's saying keep them all on the same line if possible, but just give them less space. Okay, you could control, you could line these up instead of in a row, you could line them up as a column. And so, let's see if I can do that quickly. Unfortunately, I can't remember off the top of my head. Does anyone remember for a Flexbox what the property is for specifying row or column? Nope. Okay. Well, in that case, I'm not going to try to find it. Suffice it to say, there's a property that lets me say, instead of laying it out as a row like this, lay it out as a column. So they would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 down the page. And then I could control whether it was centered or left aligned or right aligned. So Flexboxes essentially allow me to get a table cell. I think of a flexible box as like a table cell. And I can do much of the same thing with a flexible box that I could do with a table cell. I can do all kinds of vertical alignment within a flexible box. I can say, for example, if the vertical box is here, I want everything nailed to the top of it. Or I can say nail everything to the bottom of it, which I couldn't do with traditional CSS very easily. Yes? Flex direction? Okay. So, let's see. So we're going to say, what is it, flex dir? Okay. Just hyphen direction? Okay. Let's see if I say column. I think it's COL. No. Okay, I'm not getting it. I'll check it out and figure it out. But, okay. At any rate, if you're feeling up to it, take a look at Flexboxes. I won't force you to use them, but they are a very nice new addition to your arsenal of things. Now, so I will say here, page layout, there's two things you can do. So with page layout, one is use HTML layout, which is tags like section, side, header, footer. That should give the web browser. So the web browsers have their own CSS style sheets. And when you provide a style sheet, you in effect are overriding the CSS style sheet used by the browser. Okay? So anything you don't specify defaults back to whatever the web browser style sheet is using. That's why they're called cascading. The whole word meaning for cascading is you could have a whole set of them. So the web browser is the failsafe, but you could have something on top of it that is yours. Okay? So yours would be the first one used, and then if it didn't work, it would cascade back to the web browser. The other thing is sometimes it cascades up. If you have a container and you're within something and you don't specify something, then the property is controlled by your parent. So that's also part of the cascade. And if it's not the parent, then it goes up to its parent. So there's kind of two types of cascade going on there. Okay, so the first one is you can use HTML layout. My suggestion, said other way, is to use flexboxes. Okay, so questions about that. And finally, actually not finally, okay, so what I would like you to know about CSS. Everything in chapter 4 is super important. Everything in 5, not so much. Okay, I really want you to know 5.1, 5.4, and 5.5. Okay, special effects and animation are nice, but honestly, they get very complicated and you usually need to use a library. It's good to know like text shadows and box shadows, what they are, but you would normally use a library with them. Now, you should at least have some, with animation, there's a couple things here that are important. One is that you can do animation, okay, both JavaScript and CSS support animation. As the book says, the advantages of CSS is, to some extent, why use CSS? Okay, there's a bit of efficiency and smoothness. So, for whatever reasons, it seems that that browsers are able to use CSS better for efficiency. One thing the book says, and I've not been able to verify it, is that if CSS will only run animations in the current tab or the open tab, whereas JavaScript may be running it in closed tabs, and I just don't see why hidden tabs would be running JavaScript. So that just seemed like I didn't have a chance to look it up. And apparently with CSS, you can get somewhat more smooth transitions. So that's why you might use CSS animation. What is important to know about animation is keyframing. So normally you say where something starts and where something ends. These are the keyframes. Keyframe 1, keyframe 2. So you say where it begins and where it ends, and then it interpolates everything else. So the positions in between are interpolated. Should have put this up here on the line. So it interpolates everything else. You give it a time, you give it a beginning and an ending. They call it a from and the to. You give it a duration, and then it does a linear interpolation between the two. Okay? Here is what is the important thing about animation. Again, the book doesn't say it. Animation is incredibly powerful at drawing the human eye. And that's why it's used so much in graphical interfaces. Okay? Here's why, or at least the explanation I've heard, is that essentially, with our ancestors, what doesn't move can't kill you. What does move can. So our human eye tends to be switching to things that are moving. Furthermore, if there are multiple moving things, the eye tends to move between them. It doesn't tend to lock in on one. Okay, again, it makes sense in a survival situation that you would not focus on one moving thing, that your brain would keep circulating. What does this have to tell us about interface design? It says that you should, A, use animation sparingly, because once you use it, it's very hard for the eye not to keep getting drawn back. Okay, one thing I hate about the university's main website, actually, it may not be so bad anymore. But it used to be that this thing here would keep moving to a new thing. So you'd be looking down here, and like every 2 seconds, this thing would move. And what that does, every time it moves, you look. You can't help it. Okay? It breaks your concentration. And it also causes what we call a context switch. Just like a process, when it moves off the CPU, context switches, your brain, when your eye flits up to look at something, context switches. And to get back to the task at hand, it wastes some time getting back to the task at hand. So generally, you don't want to use animation unless it's really necessary in the task at hand. Of course, advertisers use it all the time because they don't want you to look at the newspaper article that you're reading. They want you to look at their advertisement, and therefore it's flashing or it's doing that or anything else to catch your attention. Okay, so use sparingly because the eye is drawn to it. The other thing I tend to say is try not to have more than one thing animated at a time. And the reason is because if you have more than one animation, it's very hard to stop your eye from tracking all of them. That is, your brain wants to move continuously from one to the other. It's just hard to stop it, okay? So if you have more than one animation running at a time, just know that that's essentially all that the person's brain is probably focusing on, or at least well focusing on, and that they're having trouble locking. It's hard to get target lock. Okay, because they're just going to keep cycling through the different animations. So those are 2 rules to know with animation. Okay, questions about that? Okay, it is so often misused, but that's also why when you're reading a newspaper article or something, you see the animation, because essentially the ad is saying, hey there, hey there, hey there, hey there, read me, read me, read me. Okay, and the other thing you should understand is the difference between animation and transition effects. So they talk about animation and they talk about transition effects. Okay, transitions are animations that occur when a property changes. Animations, there's like a subset of animations that occur when a property changes. So generally, an animation is moving things between two locations or it's swapping images. Transitions are like when a thing goes from enabled to disabled. It may gradually fade out or gradually fade to gray. Or if you change the color of something, it may gradually go through several colors before getting to the end color. Or if you change the size of something, it will slowly either increase or decrease until it gets to the appropriate color. So basically, transitions are animations that occur on a property change. Transitions are a subset. Okay, so are a subset of animations, and they're very good for drawing attention to a property change. Okay, so very good for both drawing attention to a property change and helping the brain and easing the abruptness of the change. So often it's like giving your brain a chance to catch up with what's happening. If something just goes poof, your brain may feel a sense of disorientation. Whereas if it sees it gradually close, it's a little better. Okay, think of a slamming door. Oh, got your attention, right? Okay, abruptness gets the attention of the brain, whereas doing something gradually isn't as shocking to the brain. So transitions are good at easing the abruptness of the change, making it less shocking, or in this case, getting your attention back. Okay, so questions about animations versus transitions. Now, these things are really hard to do. And I don't expect you to do them in your homework or the like. There's some examples. You do them in the book. That's great to give you a little experience. Normally, you leave it to jQuery, which is a toolkit we'll consider later in the course, or some other toolkit will handle animations because they're hard to do at the assembly language level, which is essentially what CSS is. Okay, so that is the last thing the last point I wanted to make today. I forget whether it was styling forms or page layout. I think it was page layout. Okay, so at the end of page layout, it had you put together a navigation menu where you created a horizontal navigation menu. And you might justifiably ask, how on earth would I figure out to do this on my own? And the answer is, you probably wouldn't. This is why you use toolkits, okay? I mean, the way you got this is with people twiddling with these things for hours to figure out, these are tricks, okay? The book essentially took you through a set of tricks to get to this thing right here, okay? It's hacks. Lists weren't meant to be used this way, okay? They just hacked them to get it like that. So if you look at this and you think, is Dr. van der Zanden going to put something like this on a test? No, okay? These are cute tricks, but that's why you use toolkits, because the toolkits put these tricks into little widgets like a navigation menu, and you provide a few properties like the spacing that you want or the background color, and it produces a CSS template that will generate that particular navigation menu. Okay, so if you felt overwhelmed in looking at this navigation menu, don't worry about it. It's more meant to show you CSS is powerful. If you know how to dwiddle the assembly language, you can do amazing things, okay? But for the most part, let the pros do the amazing things. They have built toolkits that will allow you to just take these objects out of the toolkit, provide some property values for them, and they will spit out the CSS styling code that's required to generate it. Okay, so don't feel overwhelmed. I mean, it's neat to work through it, to do it once or twice and see how it can be done, but don't worry about having to do that on the homework or on an exam. I won't make you do that. Okay, whereas these high-level concepts that I just went through, like animation is incredibly powerful, or the different ways you do page layout with HTML layout or flex boxes, or using what the display property is, what the difference is between the display property and the page layout. I expect you to know that. That is good high-level stuff. Okay? So when you're designing high-level stuff, you need to know these high-level principles. Okay? A lot of the low-level stuff you can use toolkits for, but the high-level stuff you really need to know. Okay, so what I'll hold you responsible for on a test is the kinds of stuff that I just did here, or that the two main things with CSS is geometry and appearance, or that if I ask you what is CSS weak at, it's vertical layout and alignment. Okay, or if I ask you what is the difference between a published document and a website, it's that a published document has discrete vertical boundaries and a website does not. But a website does have discrete horizontal boundaries just like a printed document. Okay, those are important concepts. So questions about CSS. Okay, as far as I'm concerned, CSS is the hardest thing to control of anything. And it's the thing I'm most likely to resort to a toolkit to get anything done with. Okay, the people who do it and have thought up these different things, they're pretty amazing. Okay, so the first 2 weeks of web programming are done, and we've essentially talked about how to create the appearance of your website. Okay, so that's one of the 3 things that we're worried about, the appearance. Second thing we're going to be worried about is the server side. How do you get information from what is generally a database on the server to the browser? Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about next. And then the third thing, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, will be how you control behavior in the browser. But we're going to switch to the server side right now. And in this course, we're going to talk about 2 server-side technologies, or 2 ways you can use a variety of server-side languages. Okay, there's all kinds of them. Okay, the most popular is PHP, the one we'll talk about. You can also use JavaScript. Okay, we'll talk about that. That is what you'll often hear about Node.js. That is the JavaScript server side. Okay, you can use Python. You can use Java. Okay, you can use Perl. You can use Ruby. You can use a lot of things. PHP is still #1. Oh, God. I must mention it. ASP. Microsoft. Okay, so PHP probably the most common. Actually, ASP is probably second most common. I don't know. I would actually think it's Node.js these days. That's the second most common. So in this course, we're going to talk about PHP and JavaScript. I will give you my editorial opinion right here. PHP was designed for being used as a server-side language. I love using PHP. I think it is just a seamless server-side language. I despise using Node.js. I think it is a series of hacks. That said, it is becoming more popular. to use on the server side because some people just want to program in JavaScript. And the second reason is you have these things called single-page apps. Okay, so the book, skipping ahead to chapter 12, talks about blah, 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 single-page applications. They are becoming increasingly popular. So basically, a single-page app, something like Gmail or Google Docs, they download everything onto one page. And then all they're doing is using JavaScript on the client side to keep overwriting everything on that one page. So you're never going to a different page. You're actually always on the same page, and it's simply changing what appears on that page. And it happens to be very efficient. It runs in a single thread, whereas PHP runs in multiple threads. So it so happens that single-page applications are very efficient. Okay, so we'll talk about single-page applications later in the course. Put them aside for right now. Just for the time being, put them aside. When we get to Node.js, we'll talk about single-page apps. Okay, PHP, which we'll talk about first, is not the server-side language you should be using for single-page apps. You should, if you're creating a single-page app, you should probably use Node.js. Okay, so we're putting that aside. We're going to talk about PHP. PHP was designed specifically as a server-side language. So as the book shows it, that wasn't it. Although, you know, I could use that single page anyhow. But here it is. So you have a web browser. It makes requests to the web server, say PHP. Normally, PHP goes and queries a database, usually SQL. But these days, it could also be something like a NoSQL database like Mongo. Again, we'll get to non-relational databases late in the course. It gets information back from the database, this arrow, and then it sends it back to the web browser, typically using one of two encodings, JSON, which is the most common encoding, or XML, which is an older encoding. We'll talk about JSON presently as well. Okay. What is nice about PHP is that PHP is designed to output an HTML page. So I can, is PHP running here? Yes. Okay. So let's say I just say brad.php, and I can say B for boldface, now center, Brad is great. I'm not conceited or anything. Okay, so that's it. Looks like HTML, but a PHP page can be static HTML like that. If I run it, it outputs center, Brad is great, not center. So basically, you can put static HTML into a .php page, and it will output that static HTML just like a normal thing. But you can also create what are called PHP code islands, and they start with less than question mark PHP, and they end with a question mark greater than. And inside that, you can do any kind of computation you want and create dynamic content. So I could say, for example, $x equals 3 times 5. And then I could output boldface x equals $x. Okay, so that is a small PHP code island, and that's going to generate dynamically boldface what x is equal to. So if I run that, it outputs bold x equals 15, and so I'd get a HTML document that looks like this. Okay? So the neat thing about PHP is that every PHP page, when it runs, it creates an HTML document that then gets sent to the browser. The browser interprets it as an HTML page. Okay, the nice thing is you can intermix. So with PHP, what makes it so powerful, so PHP, okay, one, it creates its output, creates its output. It doesn't have to be an HTML document, actually. It could be other things like a JSON output, but generally the idea is it creates an HTML page that gets sent to the server. To the browser, I'm sorry, to the client. Now, this is why if you want to use a single page application, you don't use PHP, because every single PHP script creates a new web page essentially. Okay? And you can intermix static HTML, can intermix static HTML content with PHP code islands that create dynamic HTML content. So typically you don't run PHP from the command line except when you're doing testing. So you will find with our website that if you try to run a PHP script, if you type in something like, say, web.eecs.utk.edu, so you put, first of all, here, you put all of your PHP scripts in here at UT, not UT, in our department. At the top level, you all have a directory called webhome. Any PHP script that you put in webhome can be executed, okay, by typing in web.eecs.utk.edu /tilde your name. Then you don't include webhome. I could just, from here, log in for a moment. Find my webhome. There we go, PHP. And let's see if we can get processform.php to work. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. Okay, so I'm going to type BVZ. Now the directory is PHP, and it was processform.php, and you can see it's producing something. Now, it was meant to be called directly from an HTML form, so it actually doesn't have anything for values because it was pulling information from a form. But if you look at it, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of stuff that looks much like an HTML document, okay? And then you see the body, you see form results, you see that I used a table, and then we'll get to it. I'm pulling stuff out of a form here. Okay, so it was expecting to get stuff from a form because I did not call it from a web page, but instead called it directly from a URL. This table had nothing in it, and so I got the blank page. But the idea is you can call it, it will run, it will produce output. Suppose there's a syntax error. Okay, let's do that. Let's create a syntax error. Okay, so I am going to say foo. That should be enough to create a syntax error. And I'll rerun it. Notice anything? Or lack thereof? Like no error message. So the problem is, the reason this is done is for security. Okay, so at UT, the lab staff has turned off all error reporting functions. The reason is that a hacker can use those error reporting facilities to probe your servers and get valuable information about it. Okay, so I could try calling this with some bad input, and if it came back and said, oh, your zip code field is wrong, can only be 256 characters, that's information a hacker might be able to use. Now that's actually good information, but there are other pieces of information that a hacker might be able to get access to. So the lab staff has turned off all error reporting. So when something doesn't work, that's when you just run it at the command line. Okay, and actually it didn't give me an error message. I'm surprised. Really shocked about that. Huh. Here, let's leave off A. Let's see if it catches that. Wow. Why are you catching that? Oh, because I'm a moron. Why do I have a closing PHP there? Oh, that's why. Wait a minute. That's right. Huh. Okay. I'm not sure. The other thing is, I think you need this right-hand tag. Don't know if you need it for sure, though. At any rate, there should have been, for some reason, it's not printing out a PHP error. I'm going to get rid of it. Okay, bottom line, I know I'm not able to produce it right now, but if you get this blank page like this, what you need to do is run it at the command line. The command line should give you error messages, okay? But the lab staff has turned it off so that if you're running something from a URL and there's a bug in it, nothing's going to happen. You're going to get a white screen, and that's the reason. Okay, so you can run PHP from the command line. That's helpful for getting syntax errors out and other kinds of things. The rest of it, you should be able to read on your own and get it. I guess the big thing, again, that I want you to get, PHP, the reason it's so nice, creates its own HTML page that gets sent to the client. You can intermix static HTML content with PHP code islands. So normally, when you run these things, if I do a grep process form.php, okay, it's being called from this form.html. So what happens is when I hit the submit button for that process form, so if I was actually to bring up this form.html, okay, I could enter some things, 21 to 30. Ooh, I like to show up late every day, but I don't want to work 12 hours. $1.50 doesn't appeal to me. Why should I comment my code? Okay, and I could enter stuff, some range stuff, my favorite color. I like purple. Not that. Not that. Oh well. Okay, submit the data, and as you can see, it is been filled in with some PHP stuff. Okay, so that's basically the idea, is that the browser calls a PHP script when you submit a form. The PHP script does something with those form data. It creates a new HTML page. It sends that new HTML page back, and the web browser displays the new HTML page. It's fairly heavyweight because you're transmitting back an entire HTML page. When we get to JavaScript in a few weeks, we'll talk about something called Ajax, which allows you to transmit back only part of a web page, and the JavaScript will then reformat the web page with whatever it gets back from the PHP backend. But for the time being, for the next couple weeks, we're focusing on PHP as generating an entirely new dynamic web page each time a form is submitted, and sending that web page back to the browser for interpretation. Okay? So next couple of weeks, we will be going over different things with PHP. So next time, PHP basics. Then we get into forms and session management, which is actually rather confusing, and the book did very little with session management. And then we'll get into regular expressions. So there's actually some stuff in the next few weeks that you probably haven't seen before. The book doesn't do a particularly good job of going into depth on, so that's why you'll be getting lectures for the next couple weeks. Okay, so I know there's not much time left. Probably you just want to take off at this point. If you want to stick around for a few minutes and complete or start filling out the in-class activity, feel free. It's not due for a couple days, so it is due by Thursday.